Welcome back to Mental Health Through Will Training by Abraham A. Lowe. This is Part 2, Chapter 11, Group Mindedness and Self-mindedness. During a panel discussion on temper and insight, the following example was offered by Bernice. Several weeks ago, my husband went with his buddy to a nearby tavern to watch the football game on television set. I asked him when he would be back, and he said about 4 o'clock. When 4 o'clock came, I got dressed as I expected him to be home any minute. Well, 4:30 came and no Bill. 5 o'clock came and Bill wasn't home yet. I became temperamental and began to work myself up. I thought he doesn't care how I feel when he thinks more the the football. Oh, I guess that meant it stood for damn football game than he does about me. Before long, I had palpitations, tightness in the stomach, and pressure in the head. I thought of calling up the tavern to tell Bill that I wouldn't stand for the way he treats me. By that time, I was very uncomfortable. Suddenly, it came to me that this was sabotage. I said to myself, "You think he is wrong, and you are right. But in recovery, we learn there is no right or wrong in domestic life. There are only irritations and discomfort, and we must not judge who is right and who is wrong. So I said these things will happen in married life, and it wasn't worth working myself up over." Pretty soon I calmed down. About 6 o'clock, Bill walked in. I asked, "Is this 4 o'clock?" He looked at me and said, "When I say 4, you should know I mean 6. I was irritated, but I didn't make an issue of it. Before I had my recovery training, I would have told him exactly how I felt, how wrong he was to do that to me, and I wouldn't have spoken to him for days. But then I would have developed all kinds of symptoms and would have suffered from them for weeks. Will Bill keep Bernice, his wife, waiting for 2 solid hours without troubling to call her? He was undoubtedly rude. But was rudeness his intention? Did he mean to be rude? Most of you know Bill, and none of you will hesitate to credit him with a gentle disposition, with the will to please, to help, and to make himself liked. And if his main features are, as I said, why does he neglect to practice them in his approach to Bernice? You may be inclined to be charitable and explain Bill's lack of consideration on the basis of his keen interest in football and television. You will then argue that because that he became wrapped up in the fascinating spectacle on the screen and naturally forgot his wife at home. Suppose this is true and the whole incident the result of an innocent lapse of memory. But when, in response to his wife's reproach, he had an incredible impertinence to proclaim, "When I say 4, you should know I mean 6." No explanation in the world could possibly atone for the crudity of that reply. When you will no doubt revise your charitable opinion about his being 2 hours late, and will grant that the delay was inexcusable and certainly call for an apology which Bill failed to offer. When taking it all in all, you will agree that Bill, our gentle and likable Bill, was rude in the one instance and savage in the other. Question arises, will Bill intend did Bill intend and plan to display rudeness and recklessness? Did he mean it? Was it his deliberate will to insult his wife, to crush her feelings? Put it into different words. This is what Bill intended to convey to Bernice. If I say something, I may mean something else. What precisely I mean is my sole concern. I am the boss, and I do not have to account for my actions. If you read this meaning into the statement, you will understand why I call it rude and savage. Married life calls for sharing, and Bill denied Bernice her due marital share. With this, he launched a rude and savage attack on her very foundation of marital structure. Was that his intention? Did he really mean to muzzle Bernice and to deny her the status of a wife? Was it his deliberate will to wreck his marriage? Marriage is a will. It is the will to share experiences, to enjoy and suffer together, to plan jointly, and to act in concert. All of it is called companionship, which is a will, the will to be and remain companions. Implying jointness and togetherness and sharing, companionship rules out individualism, which implies self-centeredness, inconsiderateness, and single-handed action. Nobody can be a companion, and an individualist at the same time, or in the same situation or relationship. But that's precisely what Bill intended to be. He wanted to be married and single acting, companion and individualist, all in one piece. His scheme of life was based on two mutually exclusive wills, the will to companionship and the will to individualism. I want you to know that everything in life that is significant, that is of significance and value, is a will. Friendship is the will to have and keep friends. To be and remain on amicable terms with your neighbors calls for the will to cultivate neighborly relations. Citizenship is the will to be desirable citizen. Honesty, the will to honest dealings. Fairness, the will to practice fair procedure. You cannot be understanding unless you free yourself of the will to misinterpret, to find fault, to be captious or literal. In the same sense, thinking is the will to draw correct conclusions from solid premises. There is the will to doubt, to believe, to be well. Even plain possessions constitute will. Your house expresses the will to ownership. Your garden, the will to add charm to your life. Your automobile, the will to enjoy legitimate comforts. Needless to add that religion, education, race, and nationality, and countless other trends, strivings, and ambitions are all wills. You will readily understand the reason why I stress this matter of the will as a force which permeates all significant phases of our daily lives. If you realize that the contemporary and modern tendency is to place the emphasis on emotions, drives, and instincts as the main power which governs human action. We in recovery will have nothing of a theory which relegates life, more particularly life in a group, to blend instincts and capricious drives. To blind instincts and capricious drives. We have solidly embraced a viewpoint which considers action as based or capable of being based on deliberate plans and settled decisions. One reasoned conclusion and firm on reasoned conclusion and firm determinations. And plans, decisions, conclusions, and determinations are all guided by the will. They are not or do not have to be driven by instincts. This is in the nature of an aside. This is in the nature of an aside remark, but is very vital sort of an aside. The wills which I mentioned before are centered around the needs and requirements of group life. They are called group-oriented or group-centered. Opposed to them are the wills which are centered around the individual or the personal self. They are individualistic or self-centered. The desire to be in a tavern instead of at home, to spend time with a chum rather than with one's wife, is self-centered will. It may be unobjectionable at times, but it is self-centered nevertheless. In order to be group-centered, you must control or hold down your self-centered desires and cravings. That is, your individualistic trends and drives. The control is exercised by the will. Once you have declared the will to join hands with another person in marriage or friendship or business, or even in a mere act of casual conversation, or some fleeting and transient endeavor, you have tied your hands and have assumed the obligation to act jointly, to share with the partner, to consider his or her needs, tastes, or feelings. Henceforth, you are no longer free and independent. You are committed to your obligation and have lost the freedom to enact individualistic behavior. In our democratic order, there is ample room for free action and independent conduct. Nobody is forced to work or to marry or to practice friendship or to worship or vote. And if you avoid obligation, partnerships, and group ties, then you retain a good measure of freedom to indulge your personal tastes and your self centered inclinations, provided they do not clash with law or morals. But even in our democratic way of life, while you are free to shun certain obligations, once you assume them, you tie yourself and lose your independence. Democracy means freedom of choosing within certain limits. But after you have chosen, you lose your freedom of inclination and are bound by the restraint of obligation. Bill assumed the marital obligation to share, but retained his individual inclination to lead an independent life. The needs, tastes, and feelings of the person he had tied himself to were neglected, ignored, or shocked. He insisted on practicing contradictory and incompatible modes of living at one and the same time: self centeredness and group centeredness, independence and restraint, refusing and sharing, drive and will, individualism and companionship, inclination and obligation. You remember I asked whether Bill meant to be rude, whether he meant to rob Bernice of her due share of matrimonial life. This term, to mean, refers to that singular capacity of the human will to toy and trifle with some activities, to mean business with others. A will which makes group centeredness its business means the group is group and not the self. It is the unqualified group minded and cease to be self minded. If it oscillates and alternates between self and group, then it toys and trifles with one or with both tendencies. It does not mean business. Bill was a good provider. At heart, he was deeply concerned about his wife's welfare. When Bernice was ill, he went out of his way to help her. In a sense, he meant to be a companion and to maintain the marital group, but he permitted his personal inclinations to interfere with and frustrate his group obligations. His will was divided, serving partly the group, partly the self. He was both group minded and self minded, meaning both members of the team of opposites. He did not mean business with either. Perhaps he did not mean to be rude, perhaps he meant to share. But whether meaning or not meaning, in all events, he did not mean business. Now, a word about Bernice. When she felt mortified and decided not to work herself up over it, when she burnt with indignation and concluded that there is no right or wrong in domestic life, when she was crushed by humiliation and refused to make an issue of it, when she did all of this, she exhibited a degree of self-control that is truly touching in its gentleness and nobility. In a savage assault of her feelings, she used her will and conquered emotion. She was thoroughly group-minded and self-oblivious, devoted to obligation and forgetful of inclinations. In short, the flower and consummation of recovery's self-help spirit. She had the will to companionship and the will to health and meant both. Okay, guys, that's it for today. Next time we'll be doing chapter 12, Subjective Wants and Objective Needs. Thank you for joining me.